right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us today, friends. It is Wednesday, which means it's an HR Matters episode. Today, we're going to talk about paid leaves, which are continuing into this year as of the recent legislation signed by the president in March. So we're going to go through those. We did one of these when that legislation was first signed, and we're going to go back into them again just because I think it bears repeating. It's worth repeating that these are things that can benefit you guys and benefit your employees, and so therefore they're a win-win for everyone. They are still not mandatory, so this is the reason why we are revisiting this. One of the reasons is because there's some decision making on your end to decide whether or not you'd like to participate in these and grant them. We'll go through all of that today, and there have been some changes to expand these to cover things like vaccination. So we'll dive into all that, and of course we'll take your questions. If you could submit them using the Q&A function of your screen, that would be great. And with me this month is my friend Emily Schlaudecker from Mammoth Think HR. Hi, Emily.
Hi, good to be here.
How are you?
I'm doing great.
Good. How are things on the West Coast?
They're going well. We've seen a little bit of a spike over here, but vaccines are rolling out pretty quickly, so optimistic.
Good. All right. So as everybody knows, FFCRA paid leaves are one of my favorite topics because they've been around now for 13 months. And so then unfortunately, they're still with us because the pandemic is still with us. And we know that everybody out there is starting to get, or a lot of people out there are starting to get vaccinated, and there's starting to be some easing of restrictions, but then there are also some hot spots around the country that are regressing. So we're very much still in the pandemic, and we wanted to reiterate that these federal programs are still available for you all as you navigate either positive cases or exposures, or now people who want to get the vaccine during work hours and or have side effects who need to stay home. So that is what we'll talk about today. And just as a reminder that this is from the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA, which has extended these tax credits for employers through September 30th. April 1st, I still put in here because the qualifying reasons change for these leaves as of April 1st. You might have a couple people who you could retroactively get the tax credits for, and I'll talk about that in just a second. And then, as I mentioned, these paid leaves are not mandatory. You'll recall that in 2020, they were a federally mandated right of all employees. As of January 1st of this year, they became optional for you guys to offer, but it really is a great option if you have employees who should or need to be out of the office because they have a COVID-19 related reason or are seeking a vaccine. So I will talk about why that's such a good thing in just a second. Emily, anything to add as we before we dive in?
Nope, I think that was a good overview.
Okay. So just as a quick reminder that you as employers have a responsibility to provide a safe and healthful workplace that is free from serious recognized hazards. This includes deadly viruses. So using these leaves helps you all too in achieving that general duty clause. And I know you guys have worked so hard in the last 13 months to provide PPE and enforce social distancing at your workplace and moving desks around and installing plexiglass and things like that. I know it's just so, we're all so over it, but unfortunately we're still inside of it a little bit here. And so just keep in mind that the virus still is around. Okay, so in a nutshell, the ARPA era paid leaves are April 1st through September 30th. Again, they're optional, but please be consistent. The legislation does specifically say that you are not allowed to offer it to some people and not others based on any reason. As long as they qualify, if they qualify, then they should get the leave. If you're going to offer it to one person, you have to offer it to all. There are expanded eligibility rules, which I'll go into in more detail in a second, but getting the vaccine is one of them. This still applies to employers with 500 or fewer employees. And all full-time, part-time, and seasonal employees' bank of hours resets as of April 1st. And I'll talk about what that means in a second, but essentially, no matter what they used in terms of paid leave prior to April 1st of this year, it doesn't matter anymore. It resets back to 80 hours or up to 80 hours of paid sick leave, and then some expanded EFMLA. So that's a big deal. I know a lot of you guys were using if you're our client, you were using our system to track that so you get the tax credits. And some clients have asked, do I need to calculate their balances from pre-April 1st? You don't, because it doesn't matter anymore about those balances. So that's a good thing. And then what stays the same? So again, it's still for 500 or fewer employees. Benefits should continue during paid leaves. As I mentioned, you shouldn't discriminate or otherwise retaliate against employees who take paid leave. The tax credit, which is I know why we're all here, is a real-time tax credit. So if you're one of our one of our clients, you would request earning codes to be set up for ESIC and EFMLA. And then when somebody takes time out under that, if somebody needs to be out of the office for a qualifying reason, you would code those hours under the special earnings codes. And then when payroll was run, the taxes are deferred back to you so that you can to make up for that compensation. So the government's essentially using those taxes to pay for those hours. If you are one of our clients and you had earnings codes set up for ESIC and EFMLA before April 1st, you still need to request that new post-April 1st ARPA era ones get set up because the taxability has changed a little bit. And so we had to set up new earnings codes. I know that's a pain, but if you fall into that category and you haven't done so already, just email customer service at dominionpayroll.com and ask for the new paid leave codes to be set up. And our team will have a couple questions for you and then they'll get those set up. The tax credit is either a maximum of $200 a day or $511 a day, depending on the qualifying reason. And we'll talk about that in a second. And then if someone uses EFMLA, the tax credit is $200 per day. And you should allow employees, if you decide to offer these leaves, you should allow them to use the leave before burning through their own PTO that they've accrued under your policy. So you shouldn't let them use up their PTO before allowing them to take these leaves. And why would you? Because you're paying for the PTO, but for these leaves, you're not paying for that, you're not paying their wages. So it makes more sense to have them use this first. And then if they still need time, you can discuss their options. So anything to add, Emily, on this slide about what's sort of staying the same?
Yeah, so just to build on that last piece about using before PTO, that's something that we've seen just sort of a spike in questions on, especially related to leave for the vaccine, because it's so often short term, right? Where previously, if someone was using leave, they were probably using the whole 80 hours, or if they were on EFMLA for childcare, like it was a more predictable long-term thing. So it is really important to make sure that you're considering exhausting this new ARPA FFCRA before requiring employees to use sick leave or PTO. And I think you had mentioned this earlier. There are situations maybe where you might find out like a day or two later, like, oh, I actually went and got my vaccine on, Saturday, and like that's why I'm out on Monday. So just being flexible and listening for those signals to know when it's going to be a qualifying leave reason.
Right. And we have a form on our website. We've updated it to now match the new qualifying reasons. But if you go to the COVID-19 resource page on our website, there's a updated request form for someone that you can use to document when someone needs to be out. And that's helpful because what the IRS is recommending is that you document these either through that form or some other method that you document the reason for the leave and keep it in their file for up to 6 years, just in case the IRS gets a wild hair and wants to audit somebody about those tax credits. I can't imagine that they would take the time to do that, but that's been the guidance that we've seen. Okay, so what has changed? So EPSL is emergency paid sick leave. It's also sometimes referred to as e-sick. As of April 1st, employers can take EPSL to get the COVID-19 vaccine and to recover from any side effects. That is new. If you have someone who took time off of work before April 1st to get the vaccine or to recover from it, and now they're like, hey, wait a minute, I took my own PTO time and I shouldn't have. Unfortunately, you can't retroactively apply this to the tax credits to them because they took it before April 1st. I know that's annoying, but that's just the situation right now. But if they took it after April 1st or on April 1st, then you'll be able to get the tax credit through September 30th. And the second bullet here, employees can take EPSL when seeking or waiting for a COVID-19 diagnosis or test result if they've been exposed or if you have asked them to get a diagnosis or test. So that's a good time to keep them out of the office, and you can pay for that. If they can't work from home, then you could pay them with these leaves and with EPSL and get the tax credit. If they can work from home while they're waiting the test result, then they would just work from home and you would pay them normally. That's not what these are getting at. These are getting at people who just can't perform their job duty remotely and or who aren't feeling well enough to work at all. The whole point is keeping them out of the office. And then I mentioned this earlier that all employees were eligible for a new bank of leave on April 1st. For EPSL, which is 2 weeks or up to 80 hours, full-time employees, assuming that they work a 40-hour work week, they get 80 hours of EPSL. Part-time employees get, a prorated amount. So you would do an average, what they would normally work on average over the course of 2 weeks. That's what they'd be entitled to for emergency paid sick leave. A lot of people think that everybody gets 80 hours no matter what their normal work week looks like, and that's not the case. They don't have to use the whole thing, like say they need to stay home for a week because they're waiting test results, and then they only use 5 days or 40 hours, and then they would still be entitled to that second half of that week or the second 40 hours between now and September 30th. So hopefully they won't have to use it again, but if they need to, because again, the virus is still with us, then that bank will still be there. So our system will make sure the tax credits are applied, but keeping track of those hours is something that's going to fall on you guys. So, either you can do it by looking in iSolved, or you can keep a spreadsheet or whatever works for you. But it's not like PTO normally where our system would accrue. It would kind of sort of track the accruals and the available balances. Our system's not quite set up to do that. So keep that in mind from an administrative aspect. It shouldn't be too difficult, but if you need help with it, you can always let us know. And that final bullet here is employers cannot provide emergency paid sick leave in a manner that favors highly compensated employees, full-time employees, or that discriminates based on how long employees have worked for the employer. So essentially, if you're going to do it for one person, you need to do it for all people. Then I think I have another slide of changes. Oh, that's for EFMLA. Anything on EPSL, Emily, before I jump into EFMLA?
Yeah, the only thing I was going to add was just in relation to calculating that prorated amount for part-time employees. We get a lot of questions about that. So as a reminder, the recommended look-back period is 6 months. So, if you have a variable hour part-time employee, it can be really difficult to be like, well, I don't know, sometimes they work 15 hours or sometimes it's 30 hours. What we are recommending and what syncs up with the DOL's guidance is to run a report of all of their hours over the last 6 months and figure out a weekly average that way, and then double it, right? So if over the course of 6 months their weekly average is 20, they would be eligible for 40 hours.
Yes, good point. Yeah, that 6-month look back period would definitely is definitely a good rule of thumb for those of you who have variable hourly employees. Great point. All right, so EFMLA is expanded or emergency FMLA, which, as you recall, a year ago was put into place to provide 12 weeks of leave for people who had children at home because their school or daycare was closed due to COVID. The original law had a much more expanded list of rules. The law that was eventually passed had EFMLA only for that childcare reason. So EPSL or E-sick can be used for illness reasons or the childcare reason. EFMLA was just for the childcare reasons. ARPA now has applied the same reasons to both, which, my goodness, if they had done that last year, would have saved us a lot of time and explanation. But anyway, here we are. A year later, they have now expanded the reasons match for both. So this includes that vaccine reason. Now, I don't know why anybody would need to use EFMLA for a vaccine, because presumably they would have already used their e-sick and that would have more than covered it. But in any case, the reasons are the same. Also, the EFMLA in 2020 had a 10-day unpaid waiting period, which has now been eliminated. And then, so now it's 12 full weeks. And then the maximum reimbursable tax credit is increased to $12,000 for that entire 12-week period. So that equates to $200 a day. Now, Emily, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, because I don't know if I keep refreshing my various government agency pages to see if there's new guidance, but what I'm a little unclear on is whether we know that the EPSL hours reset, but I'm not sure if everybody's entitled to a new 12-week bank of EFMLA.
Yeah, that is the that is the question of the day, and that's something that we are also watching pretty closely. There hasn't been a clear yes or no answer, and we do anticipate that that will come at some point. It would be very helpful if it happens sooner rather than later. What the best guidance that we've been able to receive is to sort of assume that it does reset. And it's not even related to the law itself, but in the original wording of the legislation, it was basically when you're unsure, look at the law of regular FMLA, right? And the way regular FMLA is written is that it does have a reset, like 12-month period. There are you can choose different 12-month periods, whether you go on a calendar basis or based on an employee need. So the recommendation that we've been offering is, sit tight if you can, but if you're in a situation where the employee desperately needs leave for whatever reason, consider what your previous FMLA calculation window was and follow that, because that's what we anticipate the answer will but we haven't received final confirmation of that yet.
Okay, so what we're saying in practice is if I took traditional FMLA within the last 12 months, I may not be entitled to EFMLA within those 12 months. Is that what we're saying? Or is it either way, like whether I took traditional FMLA or EFMLA in the last 12 months, we don't think I'd be eligible for another 12 weeks?
So basically it's saying consider all FMLA usage, both regular and, emergency. And then also consider what your company's look back period is. So let's say that it is based upon a calendar year, and that you took, let's just say 6 weeks of emergency FMLA last year, but that normally, if it was regular FMLA, your bank would have reset, on January 1st. Then you could assume that they would likely be eligible for more EFMLA in that regard. Or if it resets, another common calculation method is based upon last usage. So let's say that, May of last year, you ended up due to school needs, your childcare fell through in May, and you used all 12 weeks of your emergency EFMLA last year in May, that based upon that calculation method, it would essentially reset in May. And
Mhm.
so it would be reasonable to kind of apply that same rule. And now that's a good example, because May's coming up. Hopefully we'll have clarification on this soon. This has sort of just been the best stopgap guidance that we've been able to receive from, our colleagues and legal team that we consult with pretty regularly, that it's best to err on the side of caution, and you want to come up with a consistent way of doing it. But we don't exactly know what the law is ultimately going to say here.
And let's see, so practically, in this state of the pandemic, someone who might need EFMLA, certainly, well, I know schools are reopening, but there are still some schools, like my daughter's school district is closed for this entire year, school year. So there might be some people who need EFMLA for childcare reasons. But then you can use EFMLA for COVID related self-care or caring for others, which would be perhaps a COVID long hauler, or a situation where one person in the household is sick and then the other person cares for them, and then that person then has to take 2 more weeks off to be safe enough to get back into the office. So yeah, like Emily said, I think if you can sit tight and wait for some clarity on this, fingers crossed you don't have anybody who's in this situation. But if you can see something coming down the road pretty quickly, that maybe somebody needs to take time out because their children are at home, either every day or some days of the week, or you can see somebody's got a COVID outbreak in their household, then maybe the best course of action, Emily, would be to consult an attorney on that piece of it for EFMLA.
Yeah, I would say that's absolutely true for things like school closure, because the one thing to keep in mind, and if you're a smaller business with less than 50 employees, that FMLA wouldn't normally apply to you, that consulting with an attorney would be a good option. If you are a large enough company that, again, regular FMLA would apply to you, keep in mind that one of the coverage reasons is an employee's own serious health condition. So if they were a long hauler, for example, and they needed leave related to, I don't know, ongoing lung issues, whether those are resulting from COVID or whether those are resulting from something else, that would generally be covered. And the big question mark would be like, well, does the tax credit apply in this regard? So it's going to really depend on the situation. So I would say, if that comes up, and you have, some HR guidance as a resource, that would be a good time to ask them or reach out to an attorney, because there are just a lot of nuanced situations that making that decision, could vary based upon a number of factors.
Yeah, and it's not, there are a couple things to consider. Like if you're on the fence about wanting to grant these leaves in general, because for business reasons, you don't want to interrupt, you need these people in the office, et cetera. That's your prerogative right now. But also, you might have employees that really need some assistance, and this is the whole reason for this law is to make it easier on you to provide that assistance and either accommodate their needs that are COVID related, or keep them out of the office for the safety of the rest of your team or customers. So it is very, it's here, it's a win-win, because it does help you all achieve more higher levels of safety without having to pay the wages. But at the same time, we understand that, you need to run a business, and everyone's trying to, make 2021 a better year than 2020. So we will, of course, keep our eye on this EFMLA situation and update you guys as soon as we know. Emily, we have a great question in the queue here. Stacy asks, does the new e-sick leave cover quarantine time for an employee returning from voluntary domestic travel who is not approved for telework, unvaccinated, asymptomatic, and untested? quarantine per employer's health and safety protocols in accordance with the CDC's 427 travel guidelines. What are our thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so I just want to make sure that I'm understanding what I'm hearing is essentially when would EPSL apply related to travel. And it kind of goes back to the original reasons for leave that would still apply. It depends whether or not the quarantine is recommended or the quarantine is required. So we would recommend checking either any of the like travel bans in place either in your area or related to the area where the employee is traveling. Now, in most areas now, the CDC guidance is that quarantine is recommended, but it isn't actually required. So in the case where it's simply recommended and not required, that generally wouldn't apply because they're not under any sort of quarantine order, right? And it would just be the same as if they had gone to the gas station or the grocery store in your town. So if they became symptomatic or were seeking a diagnosis, then that would be covered, but just the very nature of the travel wouldn't be. But if they're traveling from an area that has like a mandatory quarantine requirement, or if your area were to implement a mandated quarantine, then it would apply.
This is taking me back to last summer when we got this question a lot. And it was, I could feel the frustration coming through from our clients who were like, I know this person just went to Florida on vacation and now they're coming back and they want to take 2 weeks off. And it just makes me think of that. But no, in all seriousness, it's sort of the same answer as last year. It's like, it just depends on where they're going to and where they're coming from.
Yep. Yeah, and the one thing I've definitely had some clients be a little bit frustrated. I mean, mostly with their employees, right? Like, why aren't they staying home and why aren't they
Right.
being safe? The one sort of thing to think about that I always kind of refer back to them is the difference of the situation, this time last year. Was that there were a lot of like very strong hotbed areas, right? So that's why we were seeing those travel bans and those quarantine mandates, where now, I mean, obviously there are still hotbeds, right? But for the most part, especially within the country itself, while there are areas that are maybe having a little bit of a harder time, the general risk is about the same. So that's why we're seeing less of that, right? That the risk is the same if you're going out to a barbecue in your hometown or if you're going the next state over to go camping or something like that. So that's why we've seen a reduction in mandated quarantine orders. But yeah, definitely just when in doubt, check the CDC guidance just to make sure. But right now there is not an abundance of travel bans.
I guess if I were Stacy and wanted to keep this person out of the office, just, like you said, because the risk is sort of the same no matter what. I mean, she could, I mean, I don't know. I'm a little bit, I apply these eligibility rules pretty liberally, just because I'm just so in favor of keeping people away from one another if they have any chance of becoming exposed. But I mean, I think she could extend EPSL to this person and probably document it and get the tax credit and make a case for it. I mean, that's what I don't know. I think that's what I would probably recommend, Stacy, but if you want to talk further about it, I'm happy to talk through it after the webinar today. I don't know all of the details.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, I mean, I agree with you. My instinct is like to try to make it fit when that's when that's an option. And the one that I think works the best is if they're seeking a diagnosis, right? So if the employee themselves is, hey, I'm going to go get tested, or if you're requiring them to get tested, the time spent doing that and waiting for the results would be considered seeking a diagnosis. When it would be a little harder to make it fit is if the employee's like, nope, all good here, or there really wasn't any attempt of that kind of seeking a diagnosis piece. The last thing that I would kind of add on to that is you as an employer do have the right to sort of set policies, not to outright ban travel, but to implement a policy around quarantine. And again, we were answering this question a lot more like this time last year, but when a 2-week quarantine was required, you could essentially say, hey, employees, if you're going out of the country, I still expect that you'll be quarantining. So your request for time off, if you're going to Mexico for a week, should include you requesting off that week to go to Mexico, but also that week or 2 weeks or whatever you decide on for quarantine. So then the employees needing to request off a longer period of time. Now that wouldn't qualify for EPSL, that would fall under their own like PTO or vacation leave, but that is an option if you want to sort of quell those travel requests, is make sure that they understand that they wouldn't be eligible for that protected leave, again, unless they became symptomatic, but that your own internal policy requires that they bake in a quarantine period to their request off time.
What if they get back from Mexico and on that Monday, they're like, oh, I've got symptoms?
Then that would apply. Yeah, then EPSL all of the sudden magically applies. And that's why, I mean, I think you mentioned it a minute ago, like this is frustrating and will probably continue to be frustrating. It just requires a lot of sort of adaptability and good communication. But yeah, at the point that any of those reasons kick in, then that would supersede. So EPSL and EFMLA, if you're offering it, always supersedes other types of paid leave.
Okay. So, because I just vividly remember last summer, and I think it's going to come up again this summer, already is really that, employers were like, so they get to go to Mexico for a week and then they get 2 weeks paid time off, like under protected leave, and trying to parse out, like you just did, the difference between them taking their own PTO as part of your internal policy for travel, or if they do develop symptoms or think that they've been exposed. And so there were a lot of employers who were skeptical that their employees were telling them the truth, and they were just trying to get some paid time off without having to burn through their PTO. So yeah, I mean, I just think being frank with people, like Emily was saying, and being adaptable and just being like, listen, we're trying to navigate this with you. We're not, the pandemic's still out there. That, it's not gone away. That travel brings risks. Work with us on this. And we just can't have you bopping back in here on Monday morning after you've been out of the country for a week. So yeah, and I think, as the weather gets warmer, travel is going to continue to be a thing, as people see all sorts of news headlines around the travel industry heating back up. This is definitely something that I think you should go ahead and talk with your leadership team about, so you can be prepared when people start really traveling. All right, and I've put the first 3 reasons for EPSL and EFMLA up on the screen. And there are 2 more that we'll talk about in a second, but these are the ones that I'll call the self-care reasons, which is having to do with you yourself possibly being exposed or sick, or getting a vaccine, or awaiting a test. So these are all paid at 100% rate of pay, with a maximum of $511 a day in tax credits that you can get back. So those are the first 3 reasons. Let's see. Oh, Stacy has followed up and she says, thanks for the examples. This question is asked as an example to set our policies for domestic and international travel for unvaccinated and unvaccinated travel, which we have many employees traveling soon. Yep. Unvaccinated and vaccinated. I gotcha. Yeah, it's an interesting time, because then you have that added thing about some people are vaccinated, some people aren't. And I know everybody probably saw the CDC put out some additional guidelines yesterday around that, what people can and can't do in terms of face coverings. But it's still pretty much the same. I mean, vaccinated people still need to wear masks indoors, certainly, and then certain outdoor situations. So, when people see those stories, the human tendency is to be like, well, we're getting so close. I'm just going to be more and more complacent. And unfortunately, that's not the case. But yeah, Stacy, if you need help with the policy, let us know. But I think it's definitely time for you guys to put something in writing and share it with your team. All right. So the second part of these qualifying reasons, so the first three, like I said, are sort of what I call the self-care reasons. The new one being that very bottom bullet, which is obtaining a COVID-19 vaccination or recovering from any related injury, disability, illness, or condition. That's new, and that's retroactive to April 1st. These are all paid at 100% regular rate of pay. And then the second or the last two are caring for somebody else. And these are paid at 2/3 the regular rate of pay. Now, this is also a little bit confusing, but if they're taking this as part of EPSL, the first three reasons are 100% rate of pay. The last two are 2/3 rate of pay. If they continue to need more leave and they dip into EFMLA, which is 12 weeks, all five reasons are paid at 2/3 regular rate of pay with a max of $200 per day in tax credits. So that's another thing to consider. The employee, if they're a long hauler with these leaves, their rate of pay is going to go down. And particularly if it's a highly compensated employee, they're definitely going to take a pay cut. They should continue to accrue benefits, to be benefit eligible and to accrue, any paid time off according to your policy. But I just wanted to point that out, that they level set all of the qualifying reasons, but they did not change the rates of pay. They didn't level set those. So those are a little different. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second. So in most cases, you'll want to exhaust the emergency paid sick leave first because it has a higher tax credit for those first three reasons, those self-care reasons, at 100% rate of pay. So you would get 100% of that compensation back. Hopefully that makes some sense. We have a question here from Lori who says, for the employee who has used PTO since April 1st for vaccination purposes, or due to vaccination side effects, I need to recode any PTO she took to a new code and adjust their PTO accordingly. Yes, that's a great question. So if you're one of our clients, or even not, you would ask your payroll provider to set up, first thing to do is set up new post April 1st earnings codes for e-sick. Then you would need to, on your next payroll run, you would need to go and adjust so that they could get their PTO back. And then you would get tax credits for the 2 hours or whatever that they took to get their vaccine. I hope that makes some sense, Lori, and our customer service team can help you do that because we've had a couple of clients asking for that these days. And then Lori also asked, can you please repeat what reasons are 100% and 2/3? I think this next slide here, Lori, will sum that up for you. So the first three reasons, when used for EPSL, which are what are called the self-care reasons, are paid at 100% with a limit of $511 per day. If in that 2 weeks of EPSL, someone uses that leave for the caring for another reasons, which is having a child at home or caring for someone who's sick, they would get 2/3 of their regular rate of pay with a limit of $200 per day. And then if they exhaust EPSL and move into EFMLA, any reason is 2/3 with a limit of $200 per day and a total cap of $12,000 per employee. That's how much the IRS is willing to give up in taxes to cover these people to be home. So again, reasons for people burning through EPSL and then going into EFMLA hopefully are decreasing as we move further and further to 2021 in terms of people being long haulers or having children at home or having to care for someone who's otherwise sick, but it's there if you need it. And it's there to offset, and the tax credits are to offset the burden on you guys. Obviously, business continuity reasons might be affected by not having people in the office, but hopefully this won't be a widespread thing as we continue to move forward through this pandemic. So Lori, I hope that's answers your question. If not, let me know. Emily, anything to add on the tax piece?
Nothing to add, but just to kind of double down on what you just said. I always sort of encourage clients to think about it in the way that you just framed it. It becomes so much easier of, is the employee taking leave for themselves, for whether that be vaccine or their symptoms or anything like that? And that would be sort of the full 100% pay. And at the point that the reason is for anyone but themselves, then that's when it would trigger the lower rate. So that's just a good kind of fact, I think, to keep in the back of your head as you're tackling this.
All right, so I believe it's my last slide. These are just some random questions that we have been hearing from people, and I'm just going to pose them to Emily and put her on the spot and see how we can best answer these. So hopefully these are some questions that have been on y'all's mind too, and we can answer them. But the first question is, now that things are opening up and employees are getting vaccinated, everybody wants to take paid time off. So this is probably what's happening in Stacy's workplace. Everybody wants to get out there and travel, and who can blame them? How do I balance business needs with supporting the opportunity to relax and recharge?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And I think it presents the perfect opportunity to be proactive in your communication to employees. So one, if you haven't already started getting a bevy of these types of requests, take the time to put out a memo or send out an email to be like, hey, we really value everyone's health and well-being. And we know that it's been really hard to be at home for the last year. But, as a reminder, here's our PTO policy. And then the practice piece of that is follow what you would have done in the past. So whether you approved PTO requests on a first come, first serve basis, or if you had like a, hey, only 2 or 3 employees can have off on the same day, reiterate that so employees know that that is still the expectation, and then encourage employees to, get requests in early or that sort of thing. But it's just a good time to kind of reset on what are the expectations. You don't need to all of a sudden just like let everybody take the same day off because we haven't been able to, get out there or take a vacation. You obviously still need to function as a business and meet the needs of the organization. So you could follow those standard guidelines, but just make sure that you're consistent. So if it is based upon, the first person to request that leave, adhere to that and stick to that for everyone. Or if you have somebody who is, just so enthusiastic about getting out there and traveling, and they put in a whole bunch of requests all at once, it would be appropriate to have a conversation of, hey, I see these and like, I appreciate you giving me notice, but, I'm going to approve the first 3. Let's wait on the others, because we do want to make sure that everyone is having an equal opportunity to take time off. So be proactive if this hasn't come up yet, knowing that it probably will. And to the extent that it has, it's a good time to reiterate your current policy.
Right. And also, right, exactly. Determine what that travel policy is per our conversation earlier about quarantining after travel.
Totally. Yeah, and then the one other thing, this is kind of tangential to this, but the other question that we're seeing a lot is like, great, now everybody's getting the vaccines and everybody's feeling really crappy the next day. Like, how do I manage that? And there's not as cut and dry of an answer there, right? Because it becomes really hard, especially where some areas vaccine availability is a little bit scant and getting an appointment feels really lucky, and you don't want to tell employees that they can't make an appointment to get the vaccine. But this is also a really good time to be proactive and meet with your management team to come up with a consistent approach. So for instance, where I work now, we're just telling everybody, like, just assume you're not going to feel well the next day, right? So go ahead and request it off. It would be better for you to surprise us and say you feel great and you're able to work than for us to like not have a backup plan or not know what our staffing is on any given day. Obviously, you don't have to mirror that approach, but also think about how you're going to approach this from a vaccination standpoint as well.
Yeah, and I think I think in 2 weeks, I'm going to do another webinar about vaccines again. I know I've done several already this year, but as we move through 2021, some interesting questions have come up that have either dovetailed with the paid leave situation or with more of a sort of privacy issues around the vaccine and whether or not to make it mandatory or discretionary. And so there's still some really interesting things to consider around the vaccine situation. So look forward to that in a couple of weeks. Okay, so the second question is, we didn't know about these until now. And some team members took PTO in April to get the vaccine. Can we retroactively apply the tax credits? And yeah, you can. You'll need to have new earnings codes set up. Even if you had earnings codes set up before April 1st, those no longer will, taxability has changed. So the new codes will apply the correct taxes and credits. So get those set up, and then you would just need to go in on the next payroll cycle and give that person back their PTO time and code those same number of hours as e-sick, and then you'll get the tax credit and they'll get their PTO back. If they took time out before April 1st to get the vaccine, unfortunately, good for them for getting it, but unfortunately you can't get the tax credit for it. So that's definitely a line there that you need to make sure you factor in. And then the third question is, what if they took PTO before April 1st to get vaccinated? They don't qualify. You could, I did have somebody who called yesterday to ask about this. You could choose to give them their PTO back because they might get wind of the fact that somebody who's taken it after April 1st gets their PTO back. That's up to you. There's nothing preventing you from doing that if you think that would be good for morale, if it's consistent. It's not their fault that this April 1st demarcation line is there. They got their appointment, they got their shot, and maybe they took a day off because they weren't feeling well afterwards. You could say, you know what, we're just going to give everybody that time back and be done with it. So that's another sort of interesting wrinkle in all of this. All right, we have one question. Can we get a copy of this presentation? We'll have it posted on the COVID-19 resource page at dominionpayroll.com by the close of business today. So we'll have the slides and we'll have the recording. So thank you. I forgot to mention that earlier. All right. So if you have any questions about this or anything else that we can chat with you about, you're welcome to submit those now in the Q&A portion of your screen. You're also welcome to submit questions to questions@dominionpayroll.com, and we'll get those answered in a timely fashion. Let's see, Anonymous says, this is very helpful. Thank you. You're very welcome. All right, so Julie has a question. If someone has side effects from the vaccine and needs to be out of work for 2 days, when we request those earning codes, would they be coded as e-sick? And is e-sick code prior to April 1st a different code? Yes. So if I'm understanding this correctly, yes, you would request e-sick codes post April 1st to be set up. If you can't, and then you would use that for anyone who's taken time off for side effects from the vaccine on or after April 1st of this year. There are e-sick codes. I think you did have e-sick codes set up, Julie, for before April 1st. Those will, I believe, no longer, I believe you would still get the tax credit, but you can't use it for vaccination reasons. So if you have someone who took time out in March for COVID, like for reasons that don't have anything to do with the vaccination, but more about, being sick with COVID or waiting a test, I believe you still could go back and use the pre-April 1st code to get that tax credit. And then make sure you document in that employee's file. But I honestly, I don't want to misspeak. That's something that customer service probably can answer better, because I'm not sure if going prior to April 1st is possible right now. So I will look into that. But if you want to email customer service, Julie, and go ahead and plant that seed, or email questions@dominionpayroll.com, we can figure it out. I hope that answered your question. And yes, it will say in iSolved, it will say, I think it says ARPA April 1st eSIC, whereas before it said like CARES Act eSIC or something like that. So it'll definitely look different too. All right, and so Lori says, I know we are allowed to ask employees if they have been vaccinated and not ask follow-up questions, but what about asking if they intend to get the vaccine? That's a good one. Emily, do you want to field that one?
Yeah, sure. So I think my immediate answer is sure, you can ask them if they intend to get vaccinated, but I think my question would be why are we asking that? Because the other thing is, in general, where we're still waiting to see where legislation shakes out on the extent to which employers can require it, it's good to limit asking any sort of like medical or personal question unless there's like a verifiable employment reason or need to do that. And whether or not they intend to get vaccinated, I'm trying to think if there's like a scenario where that would like alter their job or, be relevant to day-to-day work. So I would avoid asking it just as like a matter of, hey, I'm curious, like what the employee sentiment is on vaccines, but, maybe related to like what we were just talking about related to PTO, of asking employees to be proactive, saying, if you intend to get the vaccine, please let us know when you get an appointment. That would be okay. So yeah, asking generally is okay, but I would also recommend just being cautious and making sure that you're only asking that if it is related to work.
And I guess maybe they could be asking for business planning purposes. So back to your point earlier about just like, you guys at Mammoth have taken the approach of just assuming that once someone gets that second shot, they're going to probably feel lousy the next day. Maybe she's looking to sort of plan around those days, but in which case,
Yeah.
I like your approach of saying, if you are going to get it, please let us know, as opposed to, are you going to get it?
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's that's when it would make sense. But I also think that there are probably better questions to ask, like you just mentioned. So not, hey, like, are you intending to get the vaccine, but have you scheduled an appointment for the vaccine? Or let us know when you do schedule an appointment. Because in most cases, it's not same day, it would at least be next day. But, you could say, hey, let us know if you're working on it, or, as soon as you know that you're trying to get an appointment, that would be okay too.
Yeah, I mean, it also depends a lot on the culture, I think. I mean, there's some companies where the leadership is very pro-vax and they're incentivized, and we've all read about this in the news, they're incentivizing, they're posting videos of themselves getting vaccinated, and in that, if it's not a mandatory policy, if it remains discretionary on the employee's part, I mean, leadership, you can incentivize and educate. That's your right to do that. But still understand that you have some people out there that might be hesitant or flat out opposed, or have a disability or a religious belief that prevents them from getting the vaccine. And they might, depending on what your environment is, you might have all of your employees totally into it, and that's fine. And they volunteer that they're vaccinated, and you're sort of in this pro-vax culture. But if you're not, if there is anybody who's hesitant, you just need to think real carefully about the questions that you ask. And if they volunteer information, then that's totally up to them. But you can't otherwise sort of out them as somebody who is not going to get it. And then you should all still, the CDC has not changed its recommendation. Everyone should still be wearing masks indoors, whether they're vaccinated or not. So right now, we're still in a world where everybody should be wearing masks and not just the unvaccinated people. Because I know some people that have expressed concerns to me about the vaccine have expressed concerns about having sort of this scarlet letter of walking around with a mask while other people don't have to wear one. But right now, we're not in that situation just yet. We are in a situation where we should all still be wearing masks indoors. So hopefully your workplace is still observing that rule, and that will sort of help level the playing field a bit for those people now that you have sort of two populations of people, vaxxers and non-vaxxers. But I'm going to do in 2 weeks. Well, it's already, it's worth mentioning that I've done a full webinar on this topic that dives more into your rights as an employer around the vaccine. It's up on our website. I'm going to do another one in the definitely in the next month, probably in 2 weeks from today. But if you can't wait that long, we're always here for you. Just submit your questions to questions@submittingpayroll.com or customer service, or go on our COVID resource page and see if you can find a previous webinar that covers the topic. We have them all posted on our, not all, but a lot of the most recent ones on our YouTube channel as well. So there's that as a resource. And hopefully we can get your questions answered. Well, Emily, as always, I enjoy our discussions, and I really appreciate you taking the time to help parse through these paid leaves in the ARPA era.
Absolutely. It's great to be here.
And we will have her back in about a month. Oh, no, we won't. We'll have her colleague Kim back in about a month. So we'll have Emily in about 2 months, and who knows what we'll be talking about then. Maybe something entirely different. I don't know. But I have a feeling it might still somehow be adjacent to COVID in some way. But in any case, all of you out there, thanks again for continuously letting us prattle on throughout this last 13 months. We appreciate you. And as always, let us know if there's a topic you'd like to hear about, or if you have a question specific to your company that we haven't covered during the webinar. Otherwise, Emily, have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, you too.
And we'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.